Welcome back to the fifth session of Mishnah Zevachim with Rabbi Walfish, where it's been a pleasure learning with him these past couple of weeks. This class and our other Mishnah in-depth offerings are part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division, sponsored in her memory by her family. Mishnah in-depth is following the daily Mishnah Yomit schedule, coming together for a weekly BEU and shiur covering the previous week's materials, with the opportunity to review portions of the past week's material, go deeper into select elements of the texts, all in the context of a community of learners. We have been learning with Rabbi Walfish for the past few weeks, and we're glad to have him back. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to him.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. So let's get ourselves oriented again. We're a bit behind schedule. We finished discussing chapter 8 last time. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to catch up today. We saw that the first 7 chapters of Zevachim are the main body of the tractate. The first 5 chapters describe the Zevachim, the animal sacrifices, from different angles. Chapters 1 through 4 focus mostly on questions of intention, mental, the mental consciousness that accompanies the sacrifice. Chapter 5 gives a rundown of the different kinds of animal sacrifices and the special laws that apply to each of them. The focus, as we saw, on place, Ezehu Mekomam Shel Zevachim. What are the place? The place where the blood is brought, the place where the korban is offered or eaten, depending on what kind of korban it is. Chapters 6 and 7 focused on bird sacrifices, and that completes the survey of the different sacrifices and the procedures, the sacrificial procedures that are appropriate for all of them. Starting with chapter 8, and that's the second half of Tractates Zevachim, chapters 8 through 14. Starting with that, we have each chapter is devoted to a particular topic, and these are all sort of secondary topics that deal with different side aspects of the sacrifices. So chapter 8, as we saw, deals with when sacrifices get mixed in with other animals. That can be when the animal is alive, can get mixed in with other non-sacrificial animals that have different laws, particularly if the animals have to be destroyed for one reason or another. So that becomes a problem because you can't bring that offering on the altar. You also can't sanctify it as a sacrifice. Then you have when sacrifices get mixed in with one another. Later on, we have when parts of sacrifices get mixed up together. Okay, the limbs of sacrifices, the blood. Okay, the blood of a sacrifice gets mixed in with various other fluids. So chapter 8 deals with all of those issues, and as we saw last shiur, there are some very interesting patterns in the chapter, both in terms of concepts that recur throughout sections of the chapter, and in terms of key words that bind the chapter together. As an introduction to chapter 9, which we will turn to presently, I want to look at the very last Mishnah in chapter 8. Kol hadamim hapsulin shenitnu al gabei hamizbeach lo hirtza hatzitz el ala tameh, shatzitz miratzeh al tameh, ve'no miratzeh al hayotze. Okay, all the different kinds of disqualified blood that are brought on the Mizbeach. Now, this is the end of the section where we're talking about where blood gets mixed in, different kinds of blood from a sacrifice gets mixed in with other things. And in the course of talking about that, then the Mishnah also talked about a special law of chatat sacrifices, that when blood that's supposed to be brought on the altar outside in the courtyard is brought inside the sanctuary, then that disqualifies the blood from being used. So now, as a kind of a coda to the to this topic, the Mishnah talks about when blood has been disqualified. What if you put it on the altar nonetheless? Okay, so the Mishnah is aware that there is a case in which a korban that has been disqualified, if it's brought on the mizbeach, then it's acceptable. Okay, and that case, as this Mishnah at the end of chapter 8 notes, is the case of tameh. Okay, the case of a korban that has been defiled. Okay, and the reason why the sacrifice is acceptable, that you should not bring it because it's been disqualified. But if you ignored that or forgot about it and brought the sacrifice nonetheless, and the sacrifice was defiled, then the sacrifice is ultimately acceptable. The reason for that is what the Mishnah calls hirtza hatzitz. Okay, the tzitz is a gold plate that the Kohen Gadol hangs on his forehead, suspended from he has a kind of a head covering, and from the head covering, okay, there are chains that hang this platelet that's on his forehead. The tzitz is what's written on the tzitz is Kodesh Lashem, okay, sanctified to Hashem. And there's a pasuk in the Torah that tells us that the tzitz is liratzon lahem lifnei Hashem. The tzitz is liratzon, okay, to be accepted by God. And the halacha understood that to mean that a korban that now one of the terms, there's several terms that we find in the Torah and later in Chazal to describe what a korban accomplishes. One classic term that we find in many places is lechaper. Okay, we usually translate it as to atone, although that translation is somewhat questionable. Question we can't go into right now. But another term is ratzon. Okay, that's a term, by the way, that we've adopted in other areas of divine service. For example, we say in our Tfilat Amidah, Ritzei Hashem Elokeinu B'Amcha Yisrael Uvitfilatam. Now, originally, that prayer was recited at the end of the sacrificial service. It would read Ritzei Hashem Elokeinu B'Amcha Yisrael Uva'avodatam, the service. We don't have temple service today. We say Uvitfilatam. Okay, an echo of that initial initial context for this bracha is a minhag that some Ashkenazim have, that on Chagim, when there's Birkat Kohanim, okay, here in Eretz Israel, we say Birkat Kohanim every day, okay, but in Chutz La'aretz, the Ashkenazi minhag is to recite, is to recite Birkat Kohanim by the Kohanim themselves, only on Chagim, and some Ashkenazim have the minhag that the bracha of Ritzei on these Chagim for Musaf, when there's a Birkat Kohanim, will be concluded not Hamachazir Shchinato L'Tzion, okay, which is appropriate to our bracha, because Vashevet Avodah Lidvir Beitecha. We want Hashem to accept our prayer, but we also want Him to return us to the Beit Hamikdash, where we can offer the sacrifices. And then we conclude Hamachazir Shchinato L'Tzion. That's the way we always conclude that bracha in Tfilat Amidah. And the Chagim, some Ashkenazim have the minhag she'otcha levadcha b'yir'ah na'avod. Okay, that we will na'avod, worship you alone, okay, in awe, in reverence. That's a throwback to a Beit HaMikdash bracha, okay? Most people don't have that minhag because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, and even on Chagim, we're still praying for Hamachazir Shchinato L'Tzion. Okay, but be that as it may, that's one area where we've adopted the word Ritzei. We also have it on Birkat Hamazon of Shabbat. Ritzei v'achlitzenu. We have it on Leil HaSeder. Okay, we have Kadesh Urchatz, and at the end we have Tzafun Borei Halel Nirtza. Nirtza means to be acceptable. Okay, so that's a term that comes up in the Torah, and it's applied to the tzitz. And the rabbinic understanding was that tzitz is miratzeh. The tzitz renders acceptable a korban that otherwise would be unacceptable. Okay, and the unacceptable korban that's rendered acceptable is a korban that is tameh. And so the Mishnah here at the end of chapter 8 tells us that is the only disqualified korban that can be rendered acceptable by the tzitz. Okay, and any other disqualification, such as blood that has been rendered disqualified for one of the reasons mentioned earlier in the chapter, that will not enable the tzitz will not enable that korban to be accepted. Okay, here, let me just get the text of the Mishnah up here. Here we go. Okay, so now we'll see very shortly why that's an important introduction for chapter 9. Okay, chapter 9 opens. Okay, let's. Okay, Hamizbeach mekadesh et hara'ui lo. Rabbi Yeshua Omer kol hara'ui leishim imala lo yered. Okay, now we won't go through all the ins and outs of the drashot.
Rabbi Walfish, the text on the screen is currently the Sifra, not the text of the Mishnah.
Okay, so certain unfit items, once they have been placed on the altar, are nevertheless sacrificed. Okay, and the Mishnah teaches the altar sanctifies only items that are suited to it. Rabbi Yeshua says any item that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar. Okay, so we'll talk more about this dispute a bit further on. But what's interesting here is this notion that a sacrifice that really, a part of a sacrifice, let's say, that really should not be on the altar, im alta lo tered. Okay, so for example, we see further on in the chapter. Let's look at Mishnah 2. Ve'elu imalu lo yerdu. Halan v'tamei v'yotzei v'nishchar chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo v'shekiblu psulim v'zarku et damo, etc. So you'll notice all of these cases are sacrifices that have been disqualified. They become pasul. Okay, sacrifice left overnight. Not supposed to leave a sacrifice overnight without offering it. Okay, talking about the parts of the sacrifice that need to be offered on the altar. You left them overnight. So the next day you're not supposed to put them on the altar. They should be burnt as notar. Okay, but by mistake, a Kohen put them up on the altar. Don't take them down. Leave them up. Okay, or became ritually impure. Okay, shouldn't bring it on the altar, but if you did, leave it on the altar. Okay, or slaughtered with the intent to sacrifice it beyond its designated time, outside its designated area. Okay, we've discussed that extensively in Masechet Zevachim. Chutz lizmano, v'chutz limkamo, etc. Okay, kiblu psulim. Someone who is not a qualified Kohen, which means either he's not a Kohen at all, or he's a Kohen who has been disqualified for some reason. Okay, he could be a Baal Mum, okay, with a blemish. He could not be wearing the priestly garments. He could not have purified his hands and feet. Okay, various things that he could be tamei. Okay, and he received the blood, for example. Okay, so he should not put the blood. He should not. This sacrifice has been disqualified, and should not be brought on the altar. But if it was brought on the altar, you leave it there and don't remove it. Okay, that's the halacha here. Now, let's start with a question. No, it's a challenge question, and then we'll move on to an information question. Okay, the challenge question is, if we just learned at the end of chapter 8 that a sacrifice, once it's been disqualified, cannot be qualified again because the tzitz worn by the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz. That has this magical power to render an unacceptable sacrifice acceptable because it's liratzon, it's miratzeh. But that, we said, is limited to tum'ah, to when it's defiled. So what's the point at the beginning of chapter 9? What's the point of saying that you leave it on the altar? Leaving it on the altar isn't going to help you. Okay, the sacrifice has been disqualified. You leave it on the altar. Okay, sacrifice is still unacceptable, disqualified. What is the point of leaving it up there? Why don't you just say, forget it, made a mistake, take it off the altar, take it down? Yes, yeah.
If I may speculate, it's because the difference between the case in the beginning of chapter 9 and the end of chapter 8 is, in the end of chapter 8, you knew, it became clear that it was possible before you brought it up on the altar. In this, you find out it has become disqualified in the middle. And maybe you can't, once we have started this process of, sacrificing the animal and bringing the limbs on the altar, you can't go back. There is no, it's too late. You have already started this, you must continue. So you can't remove it to a side location.
Yes, okay. I hear the suggestion. It's a logical suggestion, but it happens not to be true.
Okay.
And it's certainly an idea that's worth considering, but ultimately it's not true. We don't really make that differentiation. Okay, so
Maybe it's because this has to be destroyed by burning somehow, and the altar is already a convenient place to do that.
Well, we usually don't treat the altar that way.
Yeah,
See,
okay.
when we have disqualified sacrifices that need to be burnt, okay, we actually encountered this last week. Then you have to burn it usually outside of the temple area. Okay, in certain cases it will be burnt inside the courtyard, but never on the mizbeach. The mizbeach is not a way of disposing of sacrifices that shouldn't be offered, but need to be burnt. Okay, so to use the altar in that way is not generally speaking correct. Okay, so these were two cogent suggestions, but they don't happen to correspond to the way sacrificial law usually works. And so let's first of all note that Rashi already picked up on this paradox. Rashi noted the connection between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9. And Rashi said at the beginning of chapter 9, excuse me, he says it actually at the end of chapter 8, Ein hatzitz meratzel hayotze, and Rashi says, Afal gav dipsulin shalu lo yerdu, artsuye miha lo martsu. Okay, so Rashi raises the question already at the end of chapter 8. Rashi says, how can the Mishnah tell us at the end of chapter 8 that the tzitz doesn't render these disqualified sacrifices acceptable when we see at the beginning of next chapter that when you brought them onto the altar, you leave them up there? So Rashi's answer is we have to separate two different concepts. One, you have one question, if it's on the altar, should I leave it there? And a completely separate question is, will this sacrifice be acceptable? So if it happens to be a problem of tumah, defilement, then the answer is yes, you should leave it on the altar, and yes, it will be acceptable because of the tzitz. But for any other kind of disqualification, we will split our answer. We'll say, yes, you should leave it up on top of the altar, but no, the korban will not be acceptable. So Rashi notes the paradox, but Rashi really just sharpens our question. So if in the end the korban is not acceptable, why should we leave it on the altar? So here, I brought a source from the Sifra. Okay, that's the Tanaitic Midrash to the book of Vayikra from Parshat Tzav. Okay, and the Sifra brings several drashot. Okay, the Sifra brings several drashot that address this issue. Okay, why leave it on the altar? Okay, so you have the Hebrew here, but we'll just focus on the English. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, all that touches the altar shall become consecrated. For this at least, we'll look at the pasuk, Kol hanogea b'mizbeach yikdash, a pasuk from Shmot, the end of chapter 29. All that touches the altar shall become consecrated. Okay, so what does that mean? Not only the sacrifice that really deserves to be on the altar, okay, sacrifice that really you should be bringing on the altar, but even a disqualified sacrifice. Now let's remember the Mishnah's condition for this. It has to be ra'ui. In other words, something that in principle could be brought on the altar. It just happened to have been somehow disqualified. It became defiled. It was left overnight. It was handled by the wrong people who are not fit for service. It was done at night. Various kinds of things that can be done to disqualify the sacrifice, but something that under other circumstances you could imagine would be brought on the altar. Meat of the animal, the fats of the animal. These are things that could be, under other circumstances, brought on the altar. So the circumstantial disqualification means I should not put it on the altar because it was disqualified. And we'll add what we learned from Rashi above. And if you put it on the altar, it will not be an acceptable sacrifice, but the Mizbeach consecrated it. And once the Mizbeach consecrated it, you can't take it down again. It remains on the Mizbeach. Okay? And Rabbi Akiva has a variation on that. Okay? Now, there are other parts of the drasha that we won't go into now, but let's look at Rabbi Yeshua's drasha. Rabbi Yeshua has a completely different drasha. Rabbi Yeshua, first of all, as we saw in the Mishnah already, he also has a different take on the halachic bottom line. He says it's not ra'ui la mizbeach, but rather ra'ui la ishim. Okay, and there are certain things that are brought on the altar, but are not put on the fire. Okay, for example, and the Mishnah notes this example at the end, towards the end of Mishnah 1. Mishnah says the difference between the opinions is dam and nesachim. The blood is brought on the altar, but where on the altar? Not on the fire. The blood is brought either against the walls or the corners of the altar, okay, for the korban chatat, on the horns of the altar, on top, okay, not on the fire. Okay, so, and similarly the nesachim, okay, the wine libation, okay, or water libation for that matter, are poured onto the base of the altar, a certain spot on the base of the altar where there were receptacles for the blood to, the wine rather, or the water to flow down into. Okay, so those are things that are worthy of the altar, they're fit for the altar, they are not fit for the fire. So the question is, in the Mishnah, what actually, as it were, claims the item that you mistakenly put onto the altar, what claims it? Does the altar claim it, or does the fire on top of the altar claim it? And what you see here in the Sifra is that this is also a difference in terms of what is the source, from which pasuk do I derive it. Okay, the first darshanim, Rabbi Yosef Glili and Rabbi Akiva, learn it from Kol Hanogea B'Mizbeach Yikdash. Mizbeach has this power that when something that has a connection, at least on a theoretical level, to the altar, when it comes into physical contact with the altar, okay, it's like a black hole. You can't break loose. Okay, gravitational pull is too great. The item becomes consecrated and needs to remain on the altar. You can't take it down again. Whereas Rabbi Yoshua has a different pasuk that he learns it from. He learns from the pasuk, Hi ha'olah al mokdah. Okay, see it here in Dalit. Hi ha'olah al mokdah, ma olah shiruya la'ishim im alta lo tered, kach kol davar shiruya la'ishim im alta lo tered. Okay, so it is the burnt offering upon its firewood. Okay, now the Torah continues and says, Al mokdah al mizbeach ad haboker, eish tamid tukar al mizbeach lo tichbet. Okay, the olah has to remain there until morning. You don't take it down until it's incinerated, which it has to be by the morning. Okay, and the pasuk a bit further on says, Eish tamid. Okay, we're all familiar with this, with the term Eish tamid. We also have in our Batei Knesset Einer tamid, that comes from the menorah. Okay, and there's an Eish tamid. The Mizbeach has an Eish tamid lo tichbeh. Okay, and so okay, okay, and so the idea that we are now extrapolating is the olah, once you put it on the fire, you cannot take down, and Rabbi Yoshua then generalizes that anything that in some constellation could be brought on the fire of the altar shouldn't be taken off the fire. So, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, the black hole that doesn't release its prey is the altar. According to Rabbi Yoshua, and as we see later also Rabban Gamliel, what doesn't release its prey, okay, is the fire. Okay, is the fire. Now, okay, so this is the source for this idea. Well, we have to think a little more about this idea. In other words, how does this black hole operate? Okay, the physical black holes out there in the in outer space, okay, they operate through an incredibly powerful gravitational pull. Okay, so what is the halachic gravitational pull, either of the altar or of the flame on the altar, or based on which opinion we're following? Okay, so before answering that, let's look at another formulation that comes up with in Rashi. When Rashi talks about Hamizbeach Mekadesh, Rashi explains as follows: Afilu davar pasul shalal hamizbeach kidsho hamizbeach leasot lachmo vein moridin oto. Something that is brought on the altar becomes the lechem, the bread or the food of the mizbeach. Okay, now Rashi takes this term lechem shel mizbeach from Bamidbar Kafchet Pasuk Bet, et korbani lachmi liishai reach nichochi tishmeru lakriv li b'moado. This describes the korban tamid. The korban tamid is described as my sacrifice, korbani, lachmi, my bread, liishai, for my flame. Okay, now that I think is okay, and Rashi later on talks about lachmo shel eish, because these are the 2 points of view that we've seen: lachmo shel mizbeach or lachmo shel eish. Okay, does the disqualified sacrifice that by accident was put on top, okay, is that the food of the mizbeach or the food of the flame? Okay, lachmi li ishai, right? So, okay, so we're already getting, I hope, a bit more of a sense of where this is leading. Let's try to work through the idea. Okay, we talked about the eish tamid tukar al mizbeach lo tichbeh, and from that pasuk, as well as from the pasuk we have here on the screen at korbani lachmi liishai, commentators such as Rav Hirsch came to the following notion: the purpose of our daily tamid offerings, and more generally of our olah offerings, and perhaps yet more generally, any offering that has a part of it brought on the altar, the idea is not that the fire on the altar is necessary to consume the parts of the sacrifices that are brought upon it, but you can actually flip the equation and say the purpose of the sacrifices that are brought on the altar is to feed the eternal fire. There is an eternal fire on the Mizbeach. The eternal fire is not there as a means to incinerate the parts of sacrifices and to incinerate them in such a way as to produce, we'll refer back again to Bamidbar 28, Reach Nichoach. We saw these terms, Reach Nichoach, at the end of chapter 4, that when you bring a sacrifice, you should intend it to be l'shem reach, l'shem nichoach. Okay, those are some of the intentions you should have when you, okay, there are 6 things you should intend according to the Mishnah there. Okay, so it's not just that the sacrifice is a reach nichoach, and therefore you need a perpetual incinerator on top of the altar to serve that function. What Rav Hirsch and others suggest is to actually reverse the equation and say there is an eternal flame. Let's think, by the way, about where this eternal flame originally came from. The original flame on the altar came from the heaven and it descended upon the altar. And that happened more than once. It happened in the book of Vayikra, in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. It happened again in Melachim Aleph, in the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, in a certain sense, the flame is divine, and when you bring an offering on the altar, it's the divine flame that accepts it. The divine flame is like a perpetual revelation. It represents the perpetual presence of God in the sanctuary, and it's the job of the Kohanim to feed that flame. They feed that flame, first of all, by putting wood upon the flame. Every day there was a wood offering that was brought onto the altar to feed the flame. But that's not the main thing that feeds the flame. The main thing that feeds the flame is the sacrifices. So more than the altar being a means for burning the sacrifices before God so that a reach nichoach will go up to God from the sacrifice, even more than that, the sacrifice feeds the eternal flame that represents the divine presence to us and represents God's acceptance of our sacrifices to God. Okay, so this flame, is like, it has 2 sides. And I think ultimately both ideas are correct. The flame is both a means and an end. the sacrifice is both an end and a means. You bring the sacrifice to express your worship of God. Okay? But you also bring the sacrifice as a means of feeding the fire on the altar. Okay? And from the other perspective, the altar is a means for incinerating the sacrifices. The altar is also an important piece of furniture in the temple in its own right, and it needs to be stoked. It needs to be preserved. Okay, for the altar to perform its function of maintaining the proper relationship between Am Yisrael and God, it has to have that eternal flame. Okay, and our sacrifices have to feed that flame. That's what keeps that flame going. That's what makes that flame meaningful and able to fulfill its symbolic function. Okay, and so now let's come to the question. Okay, so now we can understand something, even if it shouldn't have been brought as a sacrifice. Okay, the sacrifice will be discounted, it will be disqualified. But should this sacrificial limb, let's say, or fat, should it be taken down from the altar? No. Once it went up there, we say it becomes part and parcel of the framework of the altar. The altar doesn't let go of it. Okay, it becomes part of what feeds that divine flame. Okay, but now we come to the to the question of, is it something that's fit for the altar, or something that's fit for the flame? So if we say something that's fit for the flame, that fits beautifully into the idea that we've been discussing. Something that could, under other circumstances, have been put on the flame. Once it's on the flame, don't take it down. Okay, but what if by mistake you put blood on the altar that shouldn't have been there, or you put a wine libation on the altar that shouldn't have been there? Okay, so that perhaps could be taken down, because that's not something that you ever put on the flame of the altar. But the other point of view is no, that the black hole is the altar, not just the flame. Okay, why would that be? So I think the issue here has to do with, how do you see the relationship between the flame and the altar? Is the main source of sanctity the altar, and the flame is just its, let's call it, executive wing? Okay, the altar's main function is to burn sacrifices and to have the Eish Tamid on it, and so the Eish Tamid is like the pinnacle of the altar, but it's part of the altar. So anything that belongs to the altar ultimately belongs to the flame as well. Or no, the altar is just a base for the flame. Okay, if theoretically we could have had a flame floating in midair, okay, and incinerating the korbanot and being an Eish Tamid, then we would have done that, but we can't. So you need an altar to serve as a base, a platform for the flame. So I think perhaps the issue that divides the Tanaim here could very possibly be that issue. Okay, now at the end of chapter 9, we encounter something else that I think is very interesting. Okay, the last Mishnah in chapter 9, let's look at it first in the text of the Mishnah. This is the last Mishnah in the chapter. Keshem shamizbeach mekadesh et hara'ui lo, kacha kevesh mekadesh. The kevesh is the ramp that leads up to the upper part of the altar. כשם שהמזבח והכבש מקדשים את הראוי להן, כך הכלים מקדשים. Just as the altar and the ramp sanctify items that are suited to them, so too the service vessels sanctify items that are placed in them. Okay, now, first of all, just on a literary level, what's interesting about this Mishnah is that we see here a very important literary phenomenon that occurs in many, okay, and that is inclusio, okay, otherwise known colloquially as envelope structure, okay, some call it bookending. Okay, there are many chapters in Mishnah. I've calculated close to a quarter of the chapters of the Mishnah that have this phenomenon. We saw this also in the section, chapters 1 through 4, has an inclusio, okay, for the 4 chapters that are a common theme, and they open and close with mishnayot that use very similar language and themes. So here we open the chapter with Hamizbeach Mekadesh et Ha'ra'uilo, and we close the chapter with Keshem Shamizbeach Mekadesh et Ha'ra'uilo, Keshem Shamizbeach Va'kevesh Mekadshin et Ha'ra'uilo hen, right? And then, okay, and then the concluding sentence, Kach HaKevesh Mekadesh et Ha'ra'uilo, Kach HaKelim Mekadshin. Okay, in other words, it's not only the altar that sanctifies what comes in contact with them, it's also the vessels. Okay, the vessels also sanctify what comes in contact with them. Now, regarding the Mizbeach, we had 2 ideas. We had one idea that the just contact with the Mizbeach consecrates. The other idea was that when you put something on top of the Mizbeach, and particularly on top of the flame, so then the flame doesn't let go. The flame captures everything that you give to it. Can you say the same thing about the ramp? Can you say the same thing about the kelim? So we have a baraita that explains, you have a pasuk in Shmot chapter 30, Kol Hanogea Bahem Yikdash, talking about the kelim, okay, the different sanctified vessels that are used in the sacrificial service. It says Kol Hanogea Bahem Yikdash. And once again, the Midrash says, just like the Mizbeach, when we say it consecrates even things that theoretically should not have been brought on them, okay? Things that in other circumstances might have been brought on the Mizbeach, but in this case ought not to have been. The Mizbeach consecrates it. So we say the same thing about the kevesh and the kelim, about the ramp of the altar and the kelim. And now, is this like an extension of the idea of the divine fire, that where God claims things that we bring, even if theoretically he told us, no, don't bring it. It's disqualified. We brought it anyway. So God says, okay, once I got hold of it, I'm not letting go. So perhaps we're extending that to include other vessels as well. The Mizbeach, the altar, seems to be the source of this idea, but we apply it to other vessels as well. Okay, let's move on to, last time we looked at parallels between chapter 8 and chapters 1, 2. There are also some interesting parallels between chapter 9 and chapter 2. Just look at one of them briefly, 2 of them. The idea of blood, what happens to blood after it gets spilled on the floor. That comes up in these two places. And in chapter 9, we said one of the things that could disqualify sacrifice is that disqualified people received the blood. So who are these disqualified people? The list of disqualified people is at the beginning of chapter 2. Okay, so chapters 8, 9 parallel chapters 1, 2, which fits in nicely with the idea that the tractate divides into two halves. Okay, so chapters 8, 9 are the first two chapters of the second half, and they parallel the first two chapters of the first half. Well, let's move on to chapter 10. Okay, so here I'm sort of giving away the secret, but let's look at the text of the Mishnah first. Kol hatadir mechavero kodem et chavero. Okay, any offering that's more frequent than another precedes the other. Okay, for example, tmidim kodmim la musafim. The korban tamid is the daily offering. The musaf is offered only on holy days, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, festivals. Musfei Shabbat kodmim musfei Rosh Chodesh. But Shabbat is more frequent than Rosh Chodesh. Musfei Rosh Chodesh kodmim musfei Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah always comes out on Rosh Chodesh, right? And you bring the Musafim of Rosh Chodesh, and only then the Musafim of Rosh Hashanah, and so on. Next Mishnah. V'chol ha'mekudash mechavero kodem et chavero. Anything that is more sanctified than its fellow will be brought prior to its fellow. So, dam chatat kodem ledam olah. Evrei olah kodmim lemurei chatat. Okay, chatat kodemet la'ishim. Asham, rather. Asham kodem l'toda u'le'el nazir. Toda u'le'el nazir kodmim l'shlamim. So first let's talk about these two principles, which in a way actually conflict with one another. We have two principles of precedence. So first of all, that's the theme of this chapter. We've seen each chapter in the second half of the tractate takes a particular aspect of the laws of sacrifice, something that's not like the bread and butter of what do I do with the sacrifice, but what happens here, what happens there, what happens in this situation, what happens in that situation. And the situation here is I have two sacrifices that I'm supposed to bring. In what order do I bring them? So I have two principles that govern that. One is which is more frequent, tadir, and the second is which is more sanctified. Okay, we're very familiar with the first one, tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem. The principle comes up in many areas of halacha. Let me give you one lesser known example where it's actually relevant. Well, let's take an example that sure we're all familiar with. Okay, let's say Shabbat Chanukah, there's always a Shabbat Chanukah, falls on Rosh Chodesh. So I read 6 aliyot from Parashat HaShavua, 1 aliyah for Rosh Chodesh, 1 aliyah for Chanukah. In which order? First Rosh Chodesh or first Chanukah?
First Rosh Chodesh,
First Rosh Chodesh. Why?
because
Tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. Rosh Chodesh comes up every month. Chanukah comes up once a year. So the Rosh Chodesh reading will precede the Chanukah reading, right? So, okay, so that's a well-known example. A lesser-known example is if on Yom Kippur, if by the time you get up to Tfilat Musaf, it's already Mincha time, okay, usually you start Musaf later in the morning. It's a long davening on Yom Kippur, So you get to Musaf later than you normally would, but still in the course of the morning. But what if you have a chazan who really goes to town? Okay, he's an opera star, and by the time you get up to Musaf, it's already afternoon. The halacha is you should say mincha before Musaf. Because tadir, mincha is tadir, Musaf is not. Tadir v'sheno tadir, tadir kodem. The exception to that is what if it's already at a point where if you do mincha first, it'll be too late to do musaf. Okay, but in any event, that's a case where this issue comes up. Okay, so we're familiar with that. Why? Why should the more frequent come first?
Because you have a chazaka on offering this. Like I have a chazaka on the tummy because I offer it every day. I don't have a chazaka for the musaf in the same way.
Okay, so it's sort of saying like the new guy on the block, has to take second. Okay, the people who are there, the people who are so the same thing. The korban that you're used to doing, do that one first. Okay, and only afterwards, okay, you can say, okay, now there's something new that I don't usually do. So, okay, now I'll get around to doing that. It's a simple kind of etiquette, okay? It's etiquette that we're familiar with from other areas of life. If you look at the examples in the Mishnah, it could be that there's another idea involved. There's tmidim and musafim. Why are musafim called musafim? Because they're additional. Okay, in other words, can you bring a korban musaf if you didn't bring a korban tamid? Would it make sense?
I would think not.
Exactly. So maybe the reason tadir v'sheno tadir kodem is because we're saying there's a kind of hierarchical structure here. The hierarchy is the foundation is the tadir. The tadir, almost by definition, is the foundation. Okay? That's what's normally done because that's standard. That's the norm. And when there's something additional, okay, by definition, you have to add it to something you already have. Because it's really meaningless if you didn't do the foundational thing first. Okay, in other words, it's possibly like an ikar v'tafel idea. Okay, you can't have icing without the cake. Okay, the tadir is the cake. Okay, the eno tadir is the icing. The even less tadir is the cherry on top, or the whipped cream and then the cherry on top, right? So perhaps that's the idea of tadir kodem. But then we have another idea of kol mekudash mechavero kodem et chavero. Whatever is holier will come first. Okay, now that's a very, very different kind of idea. This is already, up till now, we've been talking about like a kind of logical interaction, either on the level of etiquette or on the level of the main thing, the cake and the icing. Okay, we've been using those ideas. We're saying it's a kind of logical progression. You always have to start with the foundation and then build on that the additional layers. But kol mekudash mechavero is going in a completely different direction. Kol mekudash mechavero is telling us that when you have this meeting between two different sacrifices, first bring the holier one, and only then the less holy. And that in turn raises the question, so how do we know the hierarchy? What's holier than what? And so the Mishnah gives us a list. We have chatat, then we have olah, then we have asham, then we have todah, el nazir, shlamim, bechor. Okay, and the Mishnah continues with maaser, and then ofot. Okay, now the Mishnah explains this hierarchy. It explains how we know in each. Now, chatat and olah, interestingly, we differentiate between the dam. The dam of the chatat is holier than the dam of the olah because it's miratzeh. Same word we had at the end of chapter 8, ritzui. It's miratzeh. In this case, it means because it atones. The chatat is an atoning korban that makes the blood very special. The blood of other sacrifices doesn't reconcile God with the person. The blood of the chatat is designed for that reconciliation, for the ritzui. So that makes the blood of the chatat holier than the blood of the olah. But the limbs of the olah are holier than the limbs of the chatat, because the limbs of the olah are brought on the altar. It's the language of the Mishnah, kalil la'ishim. Whereas the chatat, it's only the fats that are burned on the altar, and the rest of it is eaten by the kohanim. And so on down the line. Each two korbanot, the Mishnah explains. Now, this hierarchy should sound familiar to us.
It's very, reminiscent of
Chapter 5. Chapter 5 opened with the chatat, then the olah, then the asham, then the todah ve'el nazir, then the shlamim, then the bechor maseru pesach. And then chapter 6 added in the chatat ta'of and the olah ta'of. And that's exactly the hierarchy we have in chapter 10, except that chapter 10 adds the rationales. In other words, chapter 5 is incomplete without chapter 10. Now, chapter 5 presented the hierarchy in terms of places. Okay, in other words, in chapter 5, we said the chatat, the blood is brought inside the sanctuary sometimes even into the Holy of Holies. It goes on top of the altar. Okay, then the olah, okay, the animal is incinerated on the Mizbeach, that's its place. Okay, and then as we move down, we move to Kohanim, eating the korban inside the Azara, and then we move to Israelites eating the korban within the city walls of Yerushalayim. So that's how we reconstructed the hierarchy in chapter 5. But chapter 10 really gives us explicit rationales for the hierarchy. And in chapter 10, the hierarchy also plays an important halachic role. Because of this hierarchy, if I have two sacrifices to offer, I will know which one to offer first, the holier one. And how will I know what the holier one is? Based on this hierarchy. So chapters 5 and 10 really complement one another, and chapter 10 then continues the hierarchy down into Ofot. And here's an interesting point. Why is the Maaser? There's Maaser Behema. Okay, 1/10 of the newborns in my flock in any given year. Okay, 1 out of 10 is brought as a korban. And why is the Maaser holier than the bird offerings? Because it is a Zevach. Zevach is the name of this tractate, Zevachim. The birds are a kind of appendix to the tractate. Because the tractate is really about Zevachim. It's about all kinds of livestock offerings, including birds, but it's primarily about Zevachim, primarily about animal offerings. And there's something special about animal offerings. Bird offerings are a kind of second best in a way. Okay? And the real offerings, the bread and butter of our sacrificial service is the Zvachim. And Ofod, on the other hand, precede Menachot, that's the next tractate, because they are Mine Damim. Anything that has blood offered is again on a higher level, it's on a more sanctified level than a korban that has no blood involved with it. And we've seen throughout the tractate how central the avodah of the blood is. The avodah of the blood is, okay, perhaps the most spiritual part. The blood represents the life force. The blood is what is brought on the altar for kapara, okay? And so a korban without blood is missing a very central feature. That's also part of the hierarchy. So this chapter, chapter 10, really gives us a very important review of what is more important and less important in the sacrificial service. And that creates a hierarchy of sacrifices, a hierarchy which, by the way, we first encountered in chapter 1, okay, very briefly, which formed the backbone of chapter 5. And now in chapter 10, okay, we're given the whole picture, okay, throwing in the ofot and the menachot into the picture as well. Okay, we will conclude with that for this evening, and next time we'll have no choice but to do 3 chapters, okay, 11, 12, and 13.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Walfish. Looking forward to next week's longer session, which will be the final week of Mishnah Zevachim. Thank you for your time. And if people have any questions, you reach out to inquiry@drisha.org, and I'm happy to put you in touch. Take care.